And welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Been out of the country for a little while, visiting Constantinople, now Istanbul. I got to see the Hagia Sophia and many other things. Really interesting experience. And just returned last night. And I noticed while I was out of the country, a lot of stuff has happened. A lot of stuff has been going on. And so we need to cover some of these news items because they're certainly noteworthy and should be discussed. And so that's what we're going to do today. I want to, however, remind you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button if you appreciate Reason and Theology and the content that I offer. Let me see that support by hitting the like button, hit the subscribe button. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at a number of things that are going on right now. So it looks like John Henry Westen from LifeSite News has been removed. He was one of the co-founders of LifeSite News. Y'all have seen me do a lot of videos interacting with their material in many ways over a number of years. LifeSite News became very well known for promoting positions that were incredibly critical of the papacy, of Pope Francis, of various things in the Catholic Church, while purporting to be a Catholic news outlet. Also, it became very controversial for promoting what appeared to be a sedevacantist position, not only with the excommunicated Archbishop Vigano and his contributions to the conversation, republishing those, but also publishing a lot of articles questioning, whether or not Pope Francis was really the Pope or not, whether or not the See of Rome is vacant, sedevacantism. So we've seen a lot of that. And it looks like John Henry Westen, who was primarily behind that orientation for LifeSite News, has been removed. Let me show you what's going on here with this situation. I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see it right around now. Okay. LifeSite News founder's tenure comes to an end. So the co-founder of the pro-life news site LifeSite News has been removed as CEO and editor-in-chief of the online news organization. In July 8th news release, LifeSite News announced that its board, after careful consideration, extensive prayer, and commitment to best serve our donors, readers, and employees, guided by numerous factors aligned with our mission, was ending the tenure of John Henry Westen. In a subsequent Wednesday evening post on LifeSite News, managing director and co-founder Steve Jalasevak, hope I pronounced that correctly, pointed to a steep drop in readership and financial support in the past several years as the immediate cause of the board's lack of confidence in Westen. So, some people were thinking, okay, well, maybe they removed him because Westen is pretty critical now of Pope Leo XIV, in the same way that he's critical or was critical of Pope Francis, and for many of the same reasons. But it turns out that LifeSite News, even after removing him, is still just as critical. And so it doesn't appear that he was removed for any criticisms of Pope Leo XIV, the new Pope. It seems that for quite some time, their readership has been declining because of the orientation that Westen took LifeSite News in its criticisms of the Pope and in questioning his validity. Now, if they continue with that trajectory, which it appears that they're still going to, one wonders why they would even remove John Henry Westen if they're going to keep that same trajectory. But be that as it may, it says Jalsivak cited a 72% decline in readers in the last 3 years, as well as a fall off in new donors. That's significant, and it's especially been in the last few years that they really have been pushing a sedevacantist perspective in many ways. I've called it the news arm or outlet of Vigano, the excommunicated sedevacantist archbishop. Additionally, an internal survey revealed significant concerns regarding staff sentiment and safety scores, which further informed the board's consideration. Without major need, or without major needed change, LifeSite News cannot survive. With common sense, return to the incredibly successful founding mission and a return to collaborative management rather than top-down one-person control, it stands a very good chance of tremendous renewal for the good of all. We'll see. Founded in 1997 as an initiative of Campaign Life Coalition, the news outlet was conceived as an alternative to mainstream media, which included to the website was either ignoring or providing highly slanted reporting on pro-life issues. In a long response on X to a post that stated John Henry Westen was LifeSite News, it will be literally nothing without him, the co-founder wrote, "That is just what John Henry Westen may have wanted to believe, but it's completely false." He pointed back to the original vision of founding board member Jim Hughes and expanded on the change in editorial stance that had taken place under Westen. In recent years, John Henry worked and insisted that we change the highly successful LifeSite News mission to become a dramatically different one of a traditional Latin Mass Catholic evangelizing religious organization to draw readers into the Catholic Church according to the teachings of the Council of Trent. That's one way to put it. I don't know if that's really what gets to the essence of LifeSite News, but okay. Founding board members Jim Hughes, myself, and others strongly opposed this change, which we believed would tremendously confuse our loyal readers and subscribers, and most new people to what LifeSite News really was because the schizophrenic messaging that the new mission statement presented. Well, not only that, but the real schizophrenia was in claiming to be a Catholic news outlet while promoting sedevacantism. Just my 2 cents. Okay. Jalvisak also alluded to Westen attempting to shape the composition of the board, which led to departure of key board members. One of those board members was wholly responsible for encouraging and paying for LifeSite News to incorporate in the United States and was a very generous donor and constantly active supporter in many other ways. The board concluded its press release by stating that Westen is now on a well-earned sabbatical, spending valuable time with his family. We acknowledge the significant online speculation regarding this decision, but wish to clarify that much of it is inaccurate. We express our heartfelt gratitude to Westen for his many years of dedicated service to LifeSite News and the pro-life cause. Now, Strickland, Bishop Strickland, who has been featured very, very frequently on LifeSite News, has promoted some very interesting articles suggesting the possibility that maybe Pope Francis wasn't the Pope, although never explicitly fully saying that. Certainly, beating around the bush and indicating that, and even indicating that the Pope after Pope Francis might not actually be a Pope, and all sorts of stuff that we've seen. Of course, Bishop Strickland was removed as a bishop by Pope Francis and Cardinal Provost, who is now Pope Leo XIV. Yes, the current Pope was partly responsible for the removal of Bishop Strickland. Okay, so Strickland, until his removal by Pope Francis in 2023, has been a frequent contributor to LifeSite News. LifeSite News posted a response by Strickland to Westen's removal. Some have suggested or outright claimed that he was removed because he spoke the truth about Leo XIV or about troubling trends within the church. Let me state this clearly. He says this is not true. The internal decisions of LifeSite News are not mine to explain. However, in the same post, they don't mention this here, Bishop Strickland does indicate that he is saddened that he feels that people are spreading fake news about why John Henry Westen was removed. An irony, since many, let me rephrase, a number of people have pointed out a great deal of fake news and fake narratives promoted by not only Strickland, but John Henry Westen and LifeSite News. An irony. Be that as it may, let's continue. Though LifeSite News incorporated as a separate nonprofit in 2007 in the United States, 2009 in Canada, the connection to the Canadian pro-life organization remains strong. And LifeSite News journalist Stephen posted on X, after 8 years of working at LifeSite, I'm forced to announce that as of today, I'm actively seeking employment elsewhere. So some contributors to LifeSite News don't appear to be happy with this and are looking for other options. The Register asked him whether The two concurrent departures were coincidental, and whether conflict over editorial direction was at the heart of the shakeup. A response he wrote of errors emanating from the impostor synodal church in Rome, which owes its diabolical origins to the coup d'etat carried out by neo-modernist clergy at Vatican II, and that the media outlets have deluded themselves in the name of a false prudence, that they should treat Leo as if he is substantially different in his outlook than his heretical predecessors. So, as I've pointed out, from even before Pope Leo XIV's election to the very day that he was elected, to the day after he was elected, to pretty much today, I have pointed out whoever is elected, and it was Leo XIV, but I've said this even before he was elected. I said whoever is elected after Francis, he will continue to carry out Pope Francis's magisterium, Pope Francis's perspectives, Pope Francis's trajectory and ideology. And I was right. I was right before he was elected. I was right when I said that after he was elected. And, everything that we've seen since then has carried that out. Now, if you don't have a problem with Pope Francis, as I've always said, you probably won't have a problem with Pope Leo XIV. If you have a huge problem with Pope Francis, as I've always said, you'll probably have a huge problem with Pope Leo XIV. And that's what this individual is saying. Now, he's a critic of Pope Francis and therefore a critic of Pope Leo XIV. And he's calling out maybe the inconsistency of some people who are incredibly critical of Pope Francis, but won't apply those same criticisms to the very exact same things under Pope Leo XIV. And there's reasons for why, a number of reasons, depending on who we're talking about, but that's effectively what he's calling out from his perspective. Others want to argue that Pope Leo XIV is substantially different. He's much more traditional, whereas others have pointed out, no, it's effectively the same thing, same perspective, same magisterium, same trajectory. He just might wear some nicer liturgical garments on occasion, and use a little bit more Latin than Pope Francis did in his Novus Ordo. Okay, so that's what we're seeing with that statement. I have noticed the reaction has been that many are not happy with the removal of John Henry Westen. Many of the supporters of LifeSite News are now saying that they're no longer following LifeSite News and withdrawing their support. So I wonder if this is something that will actually end up backfiring. It looks like they wanted to remove John Henry Westen to gain more donors because they felt that they had been losing a lot in the last 3 years. I wonder if this is going to backfire and they'll just end up losing even more. Okay, so be that as it may, speaking of LifeSite News, far from changing the trajectory of their reporting, we can still see them being incredibly critical of the situation going on in the church. Now, this is an article for prior to the removal of John Henry Westen, but it is something that I want to still point out. Newly appointed Spanish bishop is on record supporting homosexual blessings. Some people are really concerned about this. They're seeing that Pope Leo has been appointing some what they would estimate to be very questionable appointments. We've covered some of those already. We're going to look at a few of them today. In this particular case, Bishop Jose Antonio Huerto was moved by Pope Leo XIV from his former diocese of Teruel and to the Malaga See. And what they're arguing is that this newly appointed Spanish bishop is on record of supporting homosexual blessings, aka fiducia supplicans. And you'll see where I'm going with that here in just a moment, because we have an update from Cardinal Fernandez on this very issue. But here they're criticizing Pope Leo XIV because they're saying, look, he's confirming this kind of stuff by putting into place bishops who are in favor of fiducia supplicans. Now, keep in mind, Pope Leo XIV, when he was cardinal, was in favor of fiducia supplicans. So that shouldn't come out as some kind of big shocker. He was already in favor of fiducia supplicans. Somebody in the chat is clarifying, well, they're not homosexual blessings, they're just blessings. But what others want to point out is that no, it explicitly says that they're blessings for homosexual couples. Now, we've looked at that in depth. I've done over 70 videos covering it. I've read the whole thing to y'all, given y'all commentary on the whole thing, and I've done 1,000 reaction videos on it. We've discussed that ad nauseum, ad infinitum. I'm not going to cover that in any detail here, since we've already, that's just beating a dead horse at this point. But the document is about blessing homosexual couples. The way Pope Francis and Fernandez understood it is that it's blessing the two persons of the couple, not the union and relationship of the couple. That's how they've attempted to pitch this idea to the church worldwide. But you can see the critics of Pope Francis and Cardinal Fernandez were not happy with that and felt like this is just simply blessing homosexual relationships, regardless of what the Pope is saying, regardless of the qualifications that are made. This is just a way to bless sin. So that's what they're concerned about here. Now, that certainly relates to some criticisms that some people are making right now in light of this news. Go ahead and share my screen and show it to you. Cardinal Fernandez. I mean, again, the author of Fiducia Supplicans. Of course, not just the author. Now, Pope Francis did confirm in his magisterium, his ordinary papal magisterium, Fiducia Supplicans, making it ordinary papal magisterium. But the principal author was Cardinal Fernandez. And Fernandez confirmed Fiducia Supplicans and blessings for homosexual couples will not, I repeat, will not cease under Pope Leo XIV. Gay blessings will remain under Pope Leo, Vatican Doctrine Chief says, according to NCR Online. A lot of people began to report on this, saying that, well, they're disappointed because they were hoping that Pope Leo XIV was going to reverse this. And I told people, you know, even before Leo was elected, and certainly after he was elected, I said, yeah, look, don't hold your breath. For better or worse, the next Pope is not going to reverse Fiducia Supplicans. And there's a number of reasons why. And that's apparent here. Leo XIV, despite what a lot of people were hoping for, is not going to reverse Fiducia Supplicans. And again, I just have to point out, why would anyone think that he was going to? He was already in favor of it as a cardinal. Why do they think that he's just going to immediately change as soon as he becomes Pope? Some people have somewhat of a maybe naive understanding of when a cardinal becomes a Pope. They think that he just miraculously becomes of a different perspective. But that's usually not the case. It's usually not how things work. And again, for better or worse, right or wrong, whether it's a good or bad thing, you know, Pope Leo XIV is not going to reverse the magisterium of Pope Francis. So that has come out very clear. And I suspect, we don't know for sure, I suspect he's going to keep in office Fernandez. I don't know. We'll find out pretty soon. He is supposed to be deciding on appointments for various dicasteries, as well as potentially writing a papal encyclical right now. And so he will determine pretty soon, long-term, who will be the Vatican Doctrine Chief, as they label it, the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. I suspect he's going to keep Fernandez in there. But anyways, Fernandez was the one who confirmed just very recently that, yeah, Leo is not going to reverse this. This will continue and will remain under this pontificate. Okay. So a lot of people are upset with that. Like you recall, as I reported, when Fiducia Supplicans came out, it was overwhelmingly something that people rejected. Laity, bishops, clergy to one degree or another, were very, very critical, and in many cases even outright rejected Fiducia Supplicans. Wildly unpopular. I pointed out, I mean, there's a lot of legitimate criticisms that could be made about it, but often the criticisms were misplaced, were based on misinformation, and thus it was hard to actually get to the legitimate criticisms because there was so much misinformation out there at the time. So a lot of people were hoping that he would reverse it, and now it's been solidified he's not going to do that. So they're really, really upset that they're not getting what they wanted here. And of course, the same group tends to also want to see more access to the Latin Mass. I've pointed out that's likely not going to happen under Pope Leo XIV for a number of reasons. So far, that appears to be the case. But we're still waiting on some more information on that. I do have a related article to go over here in just a moment about that. But let's shift over to this real quick. Another appointment here by Pope Leo XIV that appears to be wildly unpopular by some. Bishop Strickland says, some will cry too harsh, but enough is enough. With the appointment of Father Thomas Heenan, Bishop-elect, as Bishop of Baker, Oregon, we face a troubling reality. Instead of correcting the trajectory set by Pope Francis, Pope Leo XIV is doubling down on it, deepening the ambiguity that has plagued the church. Now, some are going to disagree with his take here on this bishop-elect. They're going to say he's misrepresenting him. Others are going to say he's accurate. Be that as it may, I'm just showing you what the reactions are. Father Heenan is not merely a well-meaning pastor, Strickland says. He was intimately involved in drafting pastoral guidelines that blur the clear lines of Catholic teaching on sexuality and gender. His work with Davenport's LGBTQ directive may carry the veneer of welcoming language, but in substance, it echoes the rhetorical strategies of gender ideology, undermining Catholic clarity and weakening the call to chastity. When who we are as men and women become negotiable, the gospel becomes negotiable. So he's critical of it, critical of this person. Others are pushing back, saying, no, you're misrepresenting him. So there's a big debate going on. He says this doctrinal smokescreen is the hallmark of the Lavender Mafia, a clandestine network within the church's hierarchy that protects and advances a homosexual ideology while masquerading under the banner of compassion. It gained unprecedented influence during the Francis era. From the explicit approval of same-sex blessings, there it is, that's why I was talking about Fernandez, to episcopal cover-ups, its tentacles now reach into the Leo papacy, and Father Heenan's appointment is proof. The irony here when it comes to episcopal cover-ups is I've pointed out that the Archbishop Vigano that Strickland and LifeSite News have heavily endorsed appears to have been part of that cover-up with Cardinal McCarrick. I've covered that in depth. And it appears that they're just going to sweep that one under the rug. Be that as it may, he says, Pope Francis presided over a doctrinal collapse, fiducia supplicans, green-lighted blessings of same-sex unions. Plain and simple, he says. Why? To which I just, again, have to point out, as I've said just so many times, look, if that's your perspective, you're saying the church in its magisterium officially blesses sin, because fiducia supplicans, whether you like it or not, is magisterial according to Donum Veritatis, paragraph 18. When the Pope approves a dicastery document, like a document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, it participates in his ordinary papal magisterium, and it does not specify that it has to be approved in specific form. It could be in common form in this particular case, since it's not a change to the Code of Canon Law. And I've covered that in great detail. It's magisterial. Nobody who knows anything about the magisterium would be able to dispute that. It's part of papal magisterium. So what this cashes out to is that Strickland is saying the papacy and its papal magisterium officially blesses sin. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. I mean, help me understand this. Help me understand. The claim of the magisterium is the magisterium, even in its non-infallible teachings, is still protected and guided by the Holy Spirit to a certain extent, in a certain way. Yes, different than in an infallibility, papal infallibility or conciliar infallibility, but still there's some guidance and protection there according to Pius XII and Humani Generis, among other places. Even in the ordinary papal magisterium, even when the Pope is not speaking definitively, even when the Pope is not teaching infallibly. That's the claim of the magisterium. There's some kind of guidance from God, but evidently that guidance is so slim that it can allow for the church to bless sin officially. Now, I just have to point out, look, if you believe the gates of hell will not prevail against the Catholic Church, but you also believe that the church officially can bless sin, I want to honestly challenge you on how do you really understand that? Or are you just going to limit the gates of hell will not prevail against the church to very limited acts of papal infallibility? Is that what we're limiting those claims to? Just a few instances of papal infallibility that seldomly ever occur? That's all the gates of hell will not prevail against the church really means? In a few rare ex cathedra instances, the church is protected from error. That's all it means? It's interesting because that's not what the ecumenical councils taught, like the Sixth Ecumenical Council. They teach that the see of Rome will be undefiled, not just ex cathedra teachings, but the see of Rome in its teaching authority. The whole thing will be undefiled unto the end, to use its language. It seems that it had a broader understanding of indefectibility and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. Undefiled, without blemish. If you limit the notion of the gates of hell won't prevail against the church to merely rare instances of ex cathedra, you make the notion a laughably ridiculous claim. You know, it's like saying, you know, I'll be faithful in the, you know, to my wife in these like really rare cases on Christmas Eve, between 6 to 7 p.m. I'll be faithful to my wife. That's when I promised that I'll be faithful to her, when I made my vows. What I really meant was on December 24th, between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., I wouldn't commit adultery. But I could commit adultery outside of that, right? At 5 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, every other day of the year, I can commit adultery. But I'm still faithful because during that 1 hour on one day, I'm protected, right? I'm not engaging in these things, and so I'm secure there in the claim. I mean, it becomes a just remarkably ridiculous claim to limit the protection of the church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it to just such rare situations. And so, to me, it just seems so odd that you have figures like Bishop Strickland who still stick around and say they're Catholic and maintain this position. And I've mentioned that before, and a lot of people in the comment section said, but Michael, of course he still sticks around. It's the church that Jesus established. You're not getting the point. What I'm saying is, if what Strickland says is true, the whole point is that it would seem to falsify the claim that this is somehow the church that Jesus established and the gates of hell won't prevail against her, because of the very absurd conclusion that I just brought to you. The very absurd conclusion that somehow these promises are so extremely rare in their protection. It becomes laughable and remarkable. Look, if we're going to limit protection to such rare cases, guess what? Me, Michael Lofton, I have just as good of a track record as the papacy. Just as good of a track record. You know why? I've never taught heresy speaking ex cathedra. Okay? I've never taught from the chair of Michael, ex cathedra, something that was heretical. Anytime I've ever taught heresy, I wasn't teaching in that really, really, really qualified, limited way. I was teaching outside of that. So I have just as good of a track record as papal infallibility and this other stuff. And so, again, it just becomes really absurd. I don't understand why people like this still hang around in the Catholic Church. If you honestly believe this, I don't know why you haven't concluded that Catholicism is false. Be that as it may, I digress. Going back to the topic, he says, the rupture of the magisterium blessing same-sex unions, he says, that rupture has not been undone by Pope Leo. And by the way, again, Pope Francis explicitly denies that it was a blessing of the union. Explicitly, he says it was of the two persons, not the union. But be that as it may, Strickland is still saying it's of the union. That rupture has not been undone by Pope Leo, he says. It has been compounded. As shepherds, we are called not to pick our metaphors, but to call sin precisely. And when mercy soft soils truth, souls are lost. That's interesting. I do wonder if there are some instances in the Gospels where Jesus appears to take this kind of approach as well, this soft mercy approach instead of judgment. I wonder I wonder if there's a connection. All right, moving forward, as bishops, we have sacred duty to cry out to our Holy Father. If you are serious about reform, dismantle this network of confusion. Remove ideologues who use pastoral language to conceal doctrinal erosion. Appoint shepherds who preach the unvarnished, uncompromised gospel of Christ, not politically correct euphemisms dressed in synodal platitudes. So he's starting to paint the, connect the dots and say that this stuff, these problems, they're going to Leo himself. Leo is not doing what he's supposed to do. Now, I told y'all, even before Leo was elected, I told y'all that Strickland would do this. Because I said, look, the very things that he's criticizing in Pope Francis, the next guy is going to have, and Leo does. And so if they're consistent, they're just going to say it about the next guy. And here we are. Bishop Strickland is doing exactly that. I speak not in a spirit of rebellion, but fidelity to Christ and his bride. If that is too strong for Rome, then silence from the top is deafening proof that nothing has changed. The faithful deserve better. The pride of Christ demands better. We will remain loud, unwavering, and clear. No more blessings without conversion. No more ambiguity. No more lavender mafia. Okay, well, I wonder what he is going to do when he doesn't get his way and Pope Leo just continues to remain in this trajectory. I wonder if eventually Strickland is going to conclude that Pope Leo XIV isn't actually the Pope. Okay. Somebody in the chat asks, what does it mean to bless a union anyway? Okay. I think you know the difference. I think you know to say your relationship is blessed and may your relationship be blessed by God is different than saying may you as a person be blessed by God. I think you know the difference. Okay. All right. So Strickland has followed up saying, many faithful Catholics have expressed concern over my recent comments regarding Leo XIV's appointment of Father Thomas Heenan as Bishop-elect of Baker. I write not to backtrack, but to clarify and deepen what must be said for the sake of the flock and for the integrity of the church. And by the way, if you're just now tuning in, hey, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. I really would appreciate your support. He says, a bishop is a shepherd, yes, but also a watchman. And if the watchman sounds the alarm only once the wolves are already among the sheep, many souls will be devoured. The shepherd's call must go out when the wolves are still circling, even when they wear friendly faces or familiar collars. That's interesting, because it's curious that Vatican I speaks of the papacy in this way. The papacy as the watchman, the papacy as the ultimate shepherd, the papacy as guarding and preserving the faith. But here he's saying the papacy is failing at that, so he and other bishops have to call it out. I just wonder, how does that really work with the claims of Vatican I about the papacy and its role? In light of Pope Leo XIV's recent episcopal appointments, including Father Heenan's, the wolves are indeed circling. It is no slander to say so. It's a sober warning based on what is plainly evident. Regarding Father Heenan, he was noted to have been a key contributor to the Diocese of Davenport's 2023 Guidelines for Pastoral Accompaniment of Sexual and Gender Minorities, a document that appears to speak more about inclusion and listening than about conversion, repentance, and truth. Much of the language in this document, as well as statements attributed to Heenan, would seem to imply that it's the Church's perennial teaching itself that is the source of the harm. A dangerous suggestion, he says. Also, the document frames the false anthropology behind gender ideology rather than upholding the truth that God made them male and female. So he's critical of it. Others are coming to the defense of Father Heenan and saying, no, he's being misrepresented. What is especially significant is that New Ways ministry, an organization that departs from the moral teachings of the Church, praised the Davenport guidelines that Father Heenan helped craft, labeling them a milestone for LGBTQ pastoral care. Therefore, I highlighted those who support these approaches would see this appointment as a sign of continuity with Francis-era pastoral blurring. It's been stated that Father Heenan has worked with Courage International, which faithfully helps men and women with same-sex attraction live chastely. That is commendable, Strickland says, but his involvement with the Davenport document and his lack of clear opposition to those who distort church teaching is worrisome. To those who think I spoke out of turn, I would encourage you to ask this question: why would Pope Leo appoint a bishop whose record is openly celebrated by those who reject the Church's moral teachings? So there it is. Again, he's starting to map these criticisms that he had with Pope Francis. He's making it now about the new Pope. And I do suspect Bishop Strickland will continue to go down this trajectory, and it will become more and more and more critical. of Pope Leo XIV, to the point that I'm sure, I'm absolutely certain, he will start to question whether or not Pope Leo XIV is actually the Pope. We remember what came before Pope Francis's era of confusion, where blessing same-sex unions was approved under the banner of fiducia supplicans, where doctrinal clarity was sacrificed for pastoral flexibility, where the Lavender Mafia grew bolder under his protection. Now, why does he limit this criticism to Pope Francis? Honest question. Were not these the same criticisms that people were still making about Pope Benedict and John Paul II? Yeah. FYI, these were the same criticisms that people were making about Benedict and also John Paul II. Why does he just limit these criticisms to Leo and Francis? Why doesn't he go further and say it's pretty much all of the post-conciliar popes? I'm sure Sedevacantist is probably asking that question. Why is he limiting himself to Francis here? We cannot wait until every appointment is compromised or every diocese is confused. We must speak now when the pattern is still forming. We must resist this creeping corruption while the door is still ajar, not after it has been shut behind us. The church belongs to Jesus Christ, not to networks of influence or the spirit of the age. I will point out conspicuously in his language about who's governing the church, he is usually conspicuously very negligent in talking about the role of the papacy according to Vatican I in Catholic ecclesiology. He normally ignores all that, just says it's Jesus who's in control of the church, don't leave the church, and kind of ignores everything else that Catholicism has said about the papacy leading the church and being the head of the church. I wonder why. I wonder why he leaves that stuff out. He says every bishop must one day answer to Christ the judge for whether he warned the sheep or stayed silent. I do not write this to sow division, but to speak truth and love. The people of God deserve shepherds who are both merciful and courageous, who love the sinner but never affirm the sin. When the wolves circle, the watchman must cry out. By the way, this notion of love the sinner, never affirm the sin, that is exactly what Pope Francis continually said about homosexuals and fiducia supplicans. Interesting, right? Okay, let me conclude by saying that I'm praying for Father Heenan that he may remain steadfast on the plumb line of God's truth and shepherd the faithful with integrity. I urge all the faithful to join me in prayer. Bishop Strickland. Okay. Wow. Well, he didn't stop there. He goes further. And now he's on to the St. Gallen Mafia narrative. Now, this is something we've covered a number of times here on this channel. I'm not going to cover it in depth, but it's fascinating to see this. It's fascinating to see the direction that he's going, the dots that he's attempting to connect, the statements that he's making. The St. Gallen Mafia narrative. That should be familiar to you. You know why? Because it was the St. Gallen Mafia narrative that many Sedevacantists used to say that Pope Francis wasn't the Pope. You remember that? I'll show you a bit here in just a moment from Patrick Coffin, who was using that very talking point. Statement from Bishop Strickland on the Lavender Mafia and the St. Gallen Mafia. In a recent post, I spoke of what many refer to as the Lavender Mafia. This term is commonly used to describe a hidden network of clergy within the church who engage in or protect homosexual activity, form alliances based on mutual secrecy, and often work to silence or sideline faithful priests and bishops. This network thrives on secrecy, moral compromise, and disobedience to church teaching, and its existence is tragically linked to the ongoing crisis of abuse, cover-ups, and doctrinal confusion. Speaking of doctrinal confusion and cover-ups, some of the stuff that Strickland has promoted and some of the people that he has promoted fall in that category. Irony. But the Lavender Mafia is not operating alone. Alongside it, and often intersecting with it, we must also acknowledge the existence of what is known as the St. Gallen Mafia, a term coined not by critics, but reportedly by one of its own ministers or members. This group of high-ranking prelates, including Cardinal Daniels and Cardinal Maria Martini of Italy, and Walter Casper of Germany, among others, met regularly in St. Gallen, Switzerland, beginning in the 1990s. This is the same St. Gallen where I just pointed out recently that Pope Leo XIV confirmed a very liberal appointment for. So the new bishop of St. Gallen is staunchly pro-homosexual, pro-women's ordination. Pope Leo XIV confirmed that, already did a whole video about it, saying, oh, this is a very troubling appointment. People brushed me off, said, Michael, but you got to understand how they vote on the bishop there, and you got to know this and that, and you haven't given them enough time, and yet here we are. Okay. They opposed the leadership of the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger and sought to steer the church in a more progressive, worldly direction. In an authorized 2015 biography published during his lifetime, Daniels is reported to have jokingly but revealingly coined the term for the group. The author states Daniel referred jokingly to the group as the St. Gallen Mafia. The biography also confirms that the group sought to influence papal elections and advance a vision of the church contrary to her traditional doctrines and disciplines. An irony, because some would question whether or not Bishop Strickland holds to traditional doctrines. Cardinal Daniels notably was later implicated in covering up clerical abuse in Belgium and was known for supporting moral positions at odds with Catholic teaching, including positions in support of contraception and same-sex relationships, while some have raised serious concerns about his affiliations, including potential Masonic connections. The most damning evidence comes from his own public record and the testimonies of his biographers. What is most troubling is that these two forces, moral corruption and doctrinal subversion, that's an interesting thing for him to talk about, often walked hand in hand. The Lavender Mafia undermined the church's credibility through sin and scandal. The St. Gallen group weakened her witness through strategic manipulation of leadership and teaching. All of this is ironic because in some ways people can probably apply these same criticisms to Strickland, who's making these criticisms. I do not bring this forward to spread fear or suspicion, but to speak truthfully and clearly. Christ did not promise that his church would never face corruption. He promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against her. This is our confidence. Oh, but here's the deal. Here's the deal. But Strickland's reducing the gates of hell will not prevail to like really rare, limited cases of papal infallibility. It just becomes a joke. Like I said, if I say, look, I will always be faithful to my wife, and all I really meant by that was on December 24th between 6 and 7 p.m., I won't commit adultery. But at 5, at 8, at 2 in the morning, every other day of the year, I can commit adultery. I'm still faithful, however, because when I made my promises and my vows, all I really meant by being faithful was for that 1 hour and 1 day, I'll be faithful. It becomes a joke to say, the gates of hell will not prevail against her, so of course we can't leave the church. This is the church of Jesus. It just becomes a joke. Nobody's going to be convinced by that. Catholics are not going to be convinced by that. Protestants are not going to be convinced by that. Orthodox are not going to be convinced by that. Nobody's going to be impressed by that claim. Because again, by that track record, every one of us, you and I, we all have just as good of a track record as the papacy, for that matter. Because none of us have ever erred when we spoke ex cathedra either. So it's hardly miraculous to say, well, in these rare cases, there's infallibility and inerrancy. I mean, it doesn't really take a miracle to be protected in such rare cases. I mean, frankly, to be honest with you, it just really doesn't. So it just kind of becomes a joke. But okay. For those seeking a more thorough explanation of these networks and their effects of the church, I recommend the book Infiltration, The Plot to Destroy the Church from Within by Dr. Taylor Marshall. There it is. While all historical interpretations should be read with discernment, his work documents many of these realities with clarity and courage. Others have criticized this book as very problematic in its citations, in its information, in its reliability, all sorts of things. Now is the time to fast, to pray, and to remain firmly rooted in the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the full truth, the Catholic faith, and so on and so forth. He says Jesus is Lord of his church, not cardinals, not conspirators, not even popes, and he will never abandon us. Well, that's an interesting thing. He kind of leaves the part out that the Pope is the head of the church and the See of Rome will be undefiled unto the end, and that it's the Pope who guarantees unity in the church, and that the Pope is the one who will solidify doctrinal clarity and will rightly guard and interpret and safeguard and transmit the doctrine of the faith. Like he just leaves all that out and just kind of goes to a Protestantish idea of Jesus is the Lord of the church. Okay, but where does that leave room for all the claims that the magisterium has made about the papacy? Because it's made many more grander claims than just claims about ex-cathedra teachings. So, okay. But this idea of a lavender mafia, that should sound familiar, right? You remember me engaging that with Patrick Coffin, who said that Francis wasn't the Pope. And so under Pope Francis, he said there was no Pope. Right now, it seems that he accepts Pope Leo XIV as the Pope. But under Pope Francis, he says Pope Francis wasn't the Pope. And so at the time, he held to a sedevacantist position while denying that title. Okay, so here, look at this in his presentation. The St. Gallen Mafia's 2013 conclave schemes were condemned in 1996 by John Paul II, which I showed all the problems with his argument here. I'm not going to rehash that here. I just want to point out to you that it's interesting that Strickland is bringing up the St. Gallen Mafia charges here, because that is generally used by sedevacantists to say that Francis isn't the Pope. So to talk about how that St. Gallen Mafia is still running the church today, I'm sure some people are going to try to connect the dots and say, well, see, that means Leo isn't the Pope either. Okay, let me share my screen and play just a very quick clip of that for you so you can see what I'm talking about here.
Which brings me to piece of evidence number 7. This has not to do with Benedict, but to do with the canonically illegal behavior of the St. Gallen Mafia cardinals in conspiring to vote in their man from Buenos Aires in 2013 invalidates the conclave. These left-wing modernist ideologues with red hats schmoozed, politicked, and covertly strategized to make sure that Cardinal Bergoglio would be elected Pope. They didn't hide what they did. In a moment, I'm going to mention where they brag about it. There's just one little problem. Pope St. John Paul II anticipated schemers like this and conspirators, and he wrote an apostolic constitution in 1996 titled Universi Dominici Gregis. Short of a dogmatic definition, an apostolic constitution is the highest level of legislative document that a pope can issue. Universi Dominici Gregis, you can see the link below, read it yourself. It laid down very specific rules that would...
I just have to point out that dogmatic definitions are actually found in apostolic constitution, so I'm not exactly sure that Patrick Coffin understands what's being discussed here. But okay. Anyways, I already critiqued that and showed that he did not properly address what John Paul II was saying, and the section that he cites isn't actually relevant to the thesis that he tries to bring forward. And so I'm not going to rehash that here. But I did point out that at the time, the sloppiness of it and how it doesn't actually get him to where he was trying to go with this argument. But again, this, that doesn't stop the sedevacantists from using this argument. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be salivating over the fact that Bishop Strickland is now bringing and reintroducing this discussion of St. Gallen Mafia into the current pontificate. So I found that pretty fascinating. Okay, so let's also look at this. This is from 2 days ago, showing once more that, yeah, even after John Henry Westen is gone, that does not mean LifeSite News has changed its position. Bishop Strickland, when wolves wear vestments, the synodal siege within the church. And I wonder if that's kind of an implicit shot at Pope Leo XIV. Not that he hasn't been explicit in criticizing Leo XIV elsewhere, but seems like a shot at Pope Leo XIV because he is known for wearing nicer vestments than Pope Francis. But he does seem to suggest that Pope Leo XIV is just as bad as Pope Francis in many ways, even though he wears nicer clothes, and he wants to warn the faithful not to follow these errors just because the guy is dressed a little bit more traditional and is wearing vestments. And so, that's kind of the argument here. He says the cross is still here, the Eucharist is still here, but we're surrounded by hired men who abandon the sheep, or even worse, mislead them into the thorns. But he argues that, hey, no matter what, don't leave the church, be faithful, stay faithful, he says. Don't leave the church. The gates of hell won't prevail. But as I've been pointing out in this episode over and over and over, the claim that the gates of hell will not prevail has become a joke if you adopt Strickland's position, because it means the gates of hell won't prevail against the church is so limited that it becomes laughable to suggest that somehow that's a divine protection from God. When in such rare cases, it would just be limited to just a few ex cathedra teachings. It just becomes a mockery of the entire concept. And so for him to continue to repeat, but hey, don't leave the church, it's still the church Jesus established, it just becomes hard to take seriously. Because I think if you buy into his belief that the situation is as bad as it is and the papacy is as bad as he says it is, I think you have to conclude that it's not the church Jesus established. I think you have to conclude that the gates of hell have prevailed against whatever this institution is. I think you have to conclude this is not what Catholics have claimed the church was all along, that Catholicism has been falsified. I think you have to kind of conclude at that point for other non-Catholic options, whether it's, Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism or just some non-Christian options at that point. I don't understand why people are still hanging out in this weird limbo position of saying the gates of hell won't prevail, but they then indicate that in pretty much every way the gates of hell have prevailed. Okay, so one other thing. Some traditionalists are not happy with this either. Miss B Converted says, imagine if Catholics were given dispensations like this during the centuries of persecution by Roman emperors, would Christianity have grown exponentially as it did? What is she talking about? Well, decree dispensing from the obligation to attend Sunday Mass by the Bishop of San Bernardino. For a number of reasons, he's dispensing with the people in his diocese from their obligation to fulfill their Sunday obligation, especially in relations and related to issues in relation to ICE and immigration for various reasons like that. He's saying, well, you're not obligated to go to Mass. And so people are criticizing that, saying, oh, no, you should have really just, just deal with it. And you should still go regardless of the risk. Look at all the previous generations who had to undergo all sorts of things. And it's almost reminiscent of the criticism of the bishops during COVID. Because during previous pandemics, there's actually a priest buried nearby who died giving last rites to people during a pandemic at the turn of the 20th century, knowing he was going to die for doing so, but said, I go to my death doing this because these people need the sacraments. Whereas during COVID, pretty much the bishops of the world shut down and said, we're not giving people the sacraments. And a lot of people resented that and said, well, look, if you really believe this is an ordinary means of grace, how could you betray people, especially when previous generations didn't take this mentality? They were willing to risk their lives to give people the sacraments, and you bishops aren't willing to do that. And so a lot of people were criticizing the bishops during COVID for that. And this kind of argumentation reminds me of that as well. And I really wonder how many people still recall that situation with COVID, and if everybody has forgotten it at this point. To my knowledge, only 2 bishops have apologized for that so far, Bishop Robert Barron and Bishop Strickland. I don't know anyone else who has apologized for withholding the sacraments from people during COVID. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to cover with y'all today. As like I said, when I was out of town, a lot of this stuff was going on, so I didn't have a chance to really cover any of this in any detail with y'all. Wanted to do with that with y'all today. So to catch back up with y'all and catch you up to date with all this stuff. Hope you enjoyed and appreciated a review of these things, as well as my commentary. If you do, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. I really, truly appreciate your support for the channel. And also consider supporting the channel financially at Patreon. Patreon.com/Reason of Theology, or hit the join button right next to the subscribe button right here on YouTube to financially support Reason of Theology, so we can continue to offer plenty of content to you guys for free. That's how I'm able to offer this stuff to you guys every day for free, because of the generous patrons and donors. And so please consider doing that. There is a PayPal link and also a GoFundMe link in the show notes to places where you can donate if you would like to do that as well. And you could also support the channel financially by going to rtcourses.com, R as in reason, T as in theology, courses.com, and checking out and purchasing some of my courses there. That's going to do it for today. We'll see you tomorrow.